So I want to introduce this concept of just war, which is something that we're going to be kind of connecting with in a couple different ways in our conversations about international law, in our conversations about international humanitarian law, and in our conversations about prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so when we think about this idea of just war, there's three basic questions that pop up. There's jus ad bellum, so because it's Latin, the J gets a Y sound. Jus ad bellum is the just causes for war. Under what conditions can you wage war and claim sort of the moral high ground? There's jus in bello, if you are fighting a war, how do you fight that war in a way that preserves the moral high ground? And then there's jus post bellum, which is the least developed of these three, and I'll maybe just flag very briefly, sort of ask the question about what do we owe to people and to countries after a war ends. And so does that imply reconstruction or reparations? Does that imply some sort of justice mechanism prosecuting war crimes or crimes against humanity? Does that involve some sort of cleanup of the legacy of conflict, removing landmines or cluster bombs? As I said, this is the least developed, and I think folks have really only fairly recently begun to wrestle with this question of jus post bellum and what that means under international practice and international law. And so I'll flag that is a dimension of this question, but one that doesn't have a lot of connections to international law, whereas jus ad bellum has a long tradition, dating back in the Western tradition to Augustine. There are other traditions of just war theory and jus ad bellum principles, but the writings of Augustine really end up being anchored into a lot of international institutions about how we think about the conditions under which war can be fought justly. And so I'll flag a couple of these, right? So typically for a war to be considered just, it needs to be fought as a last resort. The military force is not something that you rush into, that a moral actor will look for alternatives to this. And we sort of see this in the UN Charter, where the Chapter 7 sort of progression for the use of or the authorization of force really says, no, you need to start with diplomacy, you need to exhaust non-military mechanisms before you can claim the right to use military force under the UN Charter. So fought as a last resort is a fairly well-established principle. Waged in self-defense is I think, universally agreed principle that everybody accepts that it's okay to protect yourself when you've been attacked. It is also widely accepted that if others who can't defend themselves are attacked and you come to their aid, that is permissible. You can at least claim the moral high ground that you are, providing support or protection to those who can't protect themselves. There is a little bit of a debate over what self-defense means if you're not directly under attack, but you fear an attack is coming. And so there's a distinction that gets made between preemptive war and preventative war that I think is worth untangling. Preemptive war occurs when your adversary or your potential adversary is marshaling forces. They're on the border. A spy stumbles in out of the rain and says they're going to attack in the morning, and you know that attack is going to be utterly destructive. Under those circumstances, right, you can strike first and claim the moral high ground under this idea of preemptive war. Preventative war is different. Preventative war is you have a potential adversary that you perceive as a security threat or problem, and you anticipate that at some point in the future, you will end up fighting. And you'd rather fight now, because now would be better for you. You can do that, but you can't claim the moral high ground under just war theory, because you're not fighting as a last resort. You still have time to head off conflict. You still have time to resolve this and avoid war. Preventative war doesn't get to claim the mantle of just war theory. We typically argue under this sort of Augustinian tradition. Just war is undertaken by legitimate authority. I, as an individual, do not have the right to wage war. Militias do not have the right to wage war. The right to wage war is held by sovereigns or sovereign states. You could argue that the UN Security Council has sort of this elevated position to confer legitimacy on military action. But this ends up being really important for Augustine, that war fighting is a morally distinct category from individual morality, and it is held by these particular kind of actors, these state actors within the international system. And then the last piece in Jus ad Bellum is that you're fighting not to win, you're fighting not to get more territory, you're fighting to bring about peace. And when you have an opportunity to end a conflict, you are expected, under the idea of just war theory, to take that, because your motives for conquest, or your motives for fighting, are not conquest. They're not self-centered motives. They're motives about securing an end to the fighting. Okay, that kind of blurs into this idea of jus in bello. When you are conducting war, how do you do so in a way that is acceptable and permissible? And we're going to talk about a lot of this when we talk about international humanitarian law, but for now I want to just highlight two big principles that kind of undergird a lot of what we think about when we think about jus in bello. One is the idea that for a war to be conducted justly, it should be proportionate, that you don't respond to a raid across your border that attacks a village by nuking a city. That the responses should be calibrated in proportion to the injury that you have suffered. And that makes a lot of sense if you're thinking about this in terms of minimizing the escalation, minimizing the destruction. It might not make a whole lot of military sense under the Powell Doctrine, which is advocated by former Joint Chief of Staff Colin Powell, that when the United States goes in and uses military force, it should go in with overwhelming military force so it can win quickly and decisively. And that's actually the more just and more appropriate way to conduct war, to win quick, to win decisively, to tear the Band-Aid off and have it done with it. I'm not sure that holds under the idea of jus in bello. But there certainly is a military logic to winning quickly if you believe you can. And then finally, or I should say, and additionally, when we think about just conduct of war, we think about the discrimination between civilians who are not legitimate targets and combatants who are legitimate targets. And that as you're conducting yourself in war, you need to be cognizant of that difference, and you need to take steps to avoid harming civilians, and specifically never to target specifically civilians. That just conduct of war requires that military force be aimed at legitimate military targets. This is relatively easy when armies march in formation in uniforms out in distant fields. It's quite a bit harder in an urban setting, and it's quite a bit harder in an insurgency setting where the combatants exist within the civilian population and are more or less indistinguishable from the civilian population. But this is the challenge of just conduct in war. The other place where this pops up is with landmines, because landmines don't necessarily know or care who is stepping on them. Whether it is a soldier or whether it is a civilian is indifferent to the landmine. And so they're oftentimes considered to be inappropriate or potentially immoral weapons of war, because they are not capable of making that distinction between combatant and civilian. And the last thing I'll flag here, and again, this is something that's going to intersect with the conversations we're going to have later on, is that our conception of just war continues to evolve, and we've seen a fairly recent evolution in the last 20 or 30 years, where in the wake of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, in the wake of genocide in Rwanda, international scholars and academics began wrestling with the question about how can we legitimize military force to protect the defenseless. And this principle of responsibility to protect kind of emerges out of that debate and that discussion. And then the basic idea is that part of the reason why states have sovereignty is to provide security for their civilian populations. And if states are not providing security for their civilian populations, and indeed are a threat to their civilian populations, then that special status of sovereignty is lost by the state, and the responsibility that a state normally would have to protect and support its civilian population, that responsibility defaults up to the international community to ensure that civilian populations are protected. And while this initially began as just something that academics were talking about, it started gaining traction in the United Nations, so that in 2002, the General Assembly actually passed a resolution endorsing the principle of responsibility to protect. And in in the 2010s, during the Arab Spring, the UN Security Council authorized military action in Libya to protect civilians against the Gaddafi regime. And the United States and Britain and France took that resolution and combined it with the responsibility to protect doctrine and said protecting civilians in this context means overthrowing the government of Libya, because that government is a threat. It is an immediate threat to the civilian population. And so responsibility to protect really reshuffles a lot of our thinking about who is a legitimate authority to use force, and reshuffles a lot of our thinking about the conditions under which force can be used, and kind of creates this space around which the international community, in some sort of collective voice, can step in to respond to gross human rights abuses and atrocities, although we haven't exactly worked out how that functions in practice, and ends up being a kind of a murky and muddy space in international practice currently, but is, I think, intersects with a lot of these ideas that we've been talking about related to just war.